When you picture ancient Rome, what comes to mind sexually? For many of us, it's probably a very specific image, one often dominated by a particular kind of male sexuality, the dynamic of power and conquest. But what if there was an entire dimension, a whole rich tapestry of human experience that history largely overlooked, or maybe even deliberately obscured? What if the official narratives that we've inherited told only a tiny fraction of the real story? Today we're taking a deep dive into an incredibly challenging, yet I think profoundly important area: female same-sex relationships in ancient Rome. It's really a journey into the hidden corners of history, and honestly, it makes you question quite a bit of what you thought you knew.
And that's exactly why this topic is so fascinating and, frankly, so difficult to properly unpack. The sources we actually have for this topic are, well, they're truly complex, often contradictory, and deeply biased. It's not just about what was there, what was actually happening in people's lives back then. It's critically about who was writing the history, what their inherent biases were, and, maybe most importantly, why certain things were deemed worthy of being recorded while others were just left unsaid, dismissed, or even actively condemned. It forces us, really, to engage in a very different kind of historical thinking.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive, for you listening, is to try and cut through that silence and those biases, to attempt to reconstruct a more nuanced understanding of how female same-sex desire was perceived, documented, or crucially not documented, and how it might have been lived. We've gathered a pretty fascinating stack of sources for this, ranging from the explicit and sometimes pretty crude words of Roman poets and philosophers, to some rare and sometimes ambiguous archaeological finds and even incredibly personal, private things like magical spells. It genuinely feels like a journey into the hidden corners, searching for those quiet echoes.
Indeed. And I think beyond the specific details, this deep dive is fundamentally about understanding the mechanisms of power that shape our historical narratives. It really is. It's about trying to find those quiet echoes of voices and experiences that were almost entirely lost to the dominant historical record. And recognizing that absence, that silence in the historical record doesn't always mean absence in reality. It's a crucial distinction.
Okay, let's really try and unpack this fundamental principle of Roman sexuality, because it's just wildly different from our modern understanding of sexual identity. It wasn't about who you were inherently attracted to, right? Not your sexual orientation in the way we use that term today. Instead, Roman sexual morality and social standing were overwhelmingly about the role you played in the sexual act itself. The core concept was this incredibly rigid, active versus passive dichotomy. And this was a deeply phallocentric perspective, meaning it was entirely centered on penile penetration. For a free adult Roman man, the rule was kind of deceptively simple. He could engage in sexual relations with various partners, women, adolescent boys, even enslaved individuals, as long as he consistently maintained that dominant, penetrative position. His masculinity, his social standing, his very honor depended on playing this active role. He was the one doing the penetrating, seen as a clear sign of power and control. Now, to be the passive recipient for a free Roman man, that was profoundly shameful. It led to those derogatory terms like senatus or pathicus, which implied effeminacy and a real loss of status. These terms weren't just insults. They were hurled as grave attacks, undermining a man's very standing in society.
And this framework is absolutely crucial. It immediately tells us why female same-sex relations presented such a profound conceptual challenge for the Romans, a real puzzle for them. They simply didn't fit neatly into this dominant, passive, penetrative paradigm. I mean, think about it. If the very definition of a proper sexual act in Roman society revolved around a male penetrator and a passive recipient, then two women engaging sexually just created this conceptual void. It was labeled an offense to the system, as some sources actually put it, precisely because it lacked the natural, in their view, male penetrator. And maybe even more disruptively, it potentially allowed a woman to take on a masculine or dominant role, which was, of course, a direct affront to the patriarchal order that meticulously defined and controlled female sexuality. The whole Roman system was designed to categorize and control, and female acts just didn't compute within its fundamental male-centric logic. They fell outside the lines.
So if the Romans didn't have these clear homosexual or heterosexual identities like we do today, identities built around inherent attraction to a particular gender, how do they even begin to conceive of two women being together? Do they have specific categories for it, or was it simply sort of beyond their usual way of thinking?
That's really the core difficulty in getting a handle on these dynamics. Their morality, particularly for men, was primarily tied to the social standing of the partner. For instance, you didn't penetrate an equal citizen male. That was a big no-no. And it was crucial to ensure the dominant role was maintained. For women, well, their sexuality was strictly meant to be passive, domestic, and primarily focused on procreation within marriage, always with the male as the active agent. Female same-sex acts just didn't have a clear, defined place in this male-centric procreative system. They were outside the dominant paradigm, which inherently contributed to their marginalization, often rendering them unseen or, if they were seen, immediately problematic. It simply wasn't a category the male elite who, let's remember, produced almost all the historical records we have found relevant or even comprehensible within their rigid definitions of proper sexual conduct. This lack of a ready-made conceptual framework made it very easy for them to just dismiss it or condemn it outright.
Okay, here's where it gets genuinely striking, I think. When we compare the historical record for male homoeroticism versus female same-sex relations in ancient Rome, the disparity is just dramatic. It's almost like looking at two completely different historical realities playing out side by side. Male homoeroticism pops up pretty much everywhere in poetry, from the really bawdy comedies of Plautus to the, elegant verses of Augustan poets like Catullus. You find it in farces, satires, even in historical accounts. It's a frequent, pervasive theme explored in various literary styles and often quite openly discussed, provided, of course, those active-passive roles were maintained appropriately according to status, but female same-sex relations, almost nothing. The sources are incredibly sparse, almost eerily quiet. Ovid, that prominent poet who wrote volumes about love and desire in all its forms, even went so far as to call it unheard of in his Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love. Think about that for a second. Unheard of. The Republican early Principate eras are particularly silent on the topic, and visual art also reflects this dramatic disparity. There's just very little. So, if Ovid, a poet whose entire brand was cataloging every possible permutation of love and desire, claims it's unheard of, what does that silence truly tell us?
Well, that pervasive silence isn't necessarily proof of non-existence. And this is such a crucial point for any historical analysis, especially on marginalized topics. It's largely a consequence of who was writing history, or maybe more accurately, who was allowed to write history, and whose perspectives mattered. Most ancient sources were authored by men, elite Roman men, specifically who, let's be honest, had very little interest in women's interactions with each other, especially if men weren't physically present or involved in a sexual capacity. From their patriarchal viewpoint, non-procreative, non-male penetrative acts were often dismissed as simply not real sex, or, as Ovid famously said, unheard of. This isn't just an absence of information, it's a profound act of selective recording. It's a deliberate marginalization through a dominant male lens that deemed these experiences irrelevant or perhaps even threatening. This pervasive silence and the very limited documentation really reflect deep-seated power dynamics. They show us who shaped these historical accounts and what they deemed worthy of inclusion, or, conversely, what was actively suppressed or ignored. It's a profound bias that requires us to approach the absence itself with extreme critical awareness. We have to understand that this silence often tells us more about the observers and their anxieties than it does about the observed. It just underscores that history is written not just by the victors in war, but often by the dominant gender, rendering the experiences of others, particularly women and marginalized groups, largely invisible.
Yeah, and for centuries, this unheard of narrative was pretty much all historians had to go on. It shaped the whole field. But imagine, just for a moment, finding a crack in that massive wall of silence, like a whisper coming from another corner of Roman life entirely. Because despite this overwhelming silence from the elite male literary world, we do have some incredibly rare, almost subsurface glimpses that really challenge this idea of complete non-existence. And these are truly fascinating, precisely because they offer such a different perspective. For instance, we have these things called erotic binding spells. These are mostly Greek language spells, sometimes called depictions, found in Roman Egypt, dating roughly from the 2nd to the 4th century CE. They're incredibly private documents, not public literature intended for wide consumption. What they typically do is command a ghost or invoke various deities or demons to make one woman erotically desire another specific woman. These spells might be written on little lead tablets, pieces of papyrus, or even ostraka broken bits of pottery, and then they'd be ritually buried or hidden somewhere to activate their power. And crucially, these spells used language that was identical to heterosexual erotic spells. They just substituted female names for male ones. So what does this all mean? It means female same-sex desire was a real, actionable phenomenon, something people were actively seeking magical help for. This isn't literary theory or satire from a cynical poet. This is direct evidence of lived experience and concern. People were paying for these spells. It directly challenges that notion of complete non-existence and points towards a hidden reality, particularly outside the elite literary sphere. It suggests that these relationships or desires existed and were recognized enough, at least in some circles, for people to seek solutions or interventions for them, even if through magical means. It tells us that for the people living them, these desires were very much heard of, even if the elite weren't listening or chose to ignore it.
Oh, the presence of these spells is extraordinarily significant. They're a true historical treasure, honestly. It indicates a practical possibility and perhaps some level of social acceptance, or at least tolerance, within certain, maybe more private or non-elite circles where these magical practices often flourished. These documents demonstrate how personal, private records can offer such a vital counter-narrative to the public, male-authored record, which, as we've seen, either dismissed or condemned such desires. They show us that while elite male writers might have claimed female same-sex desire was unheard of, actual women, or at least the magical practitioners serving women, were very much aware of it and responding to it in their daily lives. It's a powerful crack in that wall of silence, revealing a hidden undercurrent of desire and relationship that official history simply chose not to acknowledge or perhaps couldn't even conceive of properly.
Okay, so despite Ovid's dismissive, unheard of, the Romans did have a way to talk about women who engaged in same-sex relations, even if they were trying to sweep it under the rug or maybe just categorize it as deviant. And yet, it wasn't exactly flattering. Enter the Tribas. What does this term, just the word itself, immediately tell us about how Romans viewed these acts?
Well, the Tribas, or tribade in the original Greek, was a pretty prominent stereotype, particularly in Latin literature from the first centuries BCE and CE. This figure was typically imagined as a masculine, often aggressive woman who took the active, sometimes even penetrative, role in sexual relations with other women. The term tribus itself comes from the Greek verb tribein, which means to rub. This implies that sexual pleasure was derived primarily from friction. Latin adopted this concept with the term frictrix, which also means she who rubs. So this etymology immediately clues us into a very male-centric attempt to define and categorize female-female acts purely in terms of physical friction. It's almost as if they were trying to grasp what could possibly be happening sexually when a penis wasn't involved. It's a very reductionist and often derogatory lens, isn't it? Stripping the act of any potential emotional or relational depth and reducing it to a crude physical mechanism.
And this figure, the Tribas, wasn't just a neutral sexual descriptor. She was considered an offense to the system, a profound societal transgression. Why was that?
Precisely. And this was profoundly significant because it involved a woman adopting what was seen as a male-dominant role. This directly challenged the inherent passivity that was expected of all female sexuality in Roman society. It upset the natural order in their view. Roman authors like Martial absolutely satirized the Tribas relentlessly. He mocked her for her supposed outsized sexual appetites and for performing penetrative sex on women, and even, in some of his more crude poems, on boys. He often depicted her as explicitly un-Roman or as a symptom of degenerate Greek perversion. The disdain was palpable. It functioned as a clear warning, almost like an ideological weapon to police women's behavior.
Why such intense hostility, though? I mean, beyond just disapproval, what does this stereotype and the sheer intensity of the satire and condemnation around it truly reveal about Roman society and its underlying anxieties?
Well, the Roman preoccupation with the active-passive sexual dichotomy, especially when applied to women, really reveals a profound cultural apprehension about female agency and independence. They were clearly nervous about it. The Tribas stereotype functioned not merely as a description of a sexual preference, but as a potent instrument to regulate gender roles and reinforce patriarchal authority. That was its social function. By pathologizing and ridiculing women who dared to deviate from the expected passive femininity, Roman society sought to maintain its established order and contain what it perceived as threats to male dominance. So the hostility directed at the Tribas was probably less about the specific sexual act itself, though they found that confusing too, and much more about the perceived transgression of fundamental gender boundaries. A woman who adopted a masculine sexual role directly challenged the very foundation of Roman patriarchy, a system which relied heavily on women's prescribed passivity, their confinement to domestic roles, and their primary function being procreation within legal marriages. Think of Martial's vivid and often frankly disgusting depiction of Philinus, that masculine Greek woman who took the penetrative role with women and boys. He specifically highlighted her un-Roman nature, making it crystal clear that this wasn't just sexual deviancy in his eyes, but a fundamental cultural and gender transgression. The Tribas stereotype, therefore, served as a powerful cultural warning against female independence and a means of enforcing social control by shaming and marginalizing those who dared to deviate from these rigid gender expectations. It was basically a societal policing mechanism in poetic form.
Yeah, and modern scholarship really paints a very clear picture here. Roman men harbored significant, often profound, hostility towards female same-sex relationships. It wasn't just a casual disapproval, it seems to have been seen as something that fundamentally challenged their view of themselves as the exclusive givers of sexual pleasure, as the active force in all sexual encounters. It really struck at the very foundations of Rome's male-dominated culture and the established sexual hierarchy they valued so much. And then there was that crucial societal obligation for Roman women. You had to marry Roman men and produce legitimate offspring. With incredibly high infant mortality rates and a constant need for new citizens to fuel the legions in the empire, procreation was highly valued by both the state and society. Emperor Augustus even enacted laws specifically to encourage marriage and childbearing, offering incentives to families with many children and imposing penalties on childless couples. So, exclusive same-sex relationships were seen as directly impeding this crucial contribution to the population. It wasn't just about individual desire or morality. It was framed as being against the state's interest in population growth, continuity, and overall societal stability.
Exactly, and those imperial portrayals of women engaging in masculine behaviors, the ones depicted by satirists like Juvenal and Martial Eller, they aren't just about sex, are they? They reflect broader cultural anxieties concerning the increasing independence and evolving roles of Roman women in a society that was undergoing significant changes. These authors often depicted women, supposedly sodomizing boys, consuming food and drink like men in public spaces, participating in vigorous physical regimens usually reserved for men, or even engaging in what they considered excessively intellectual pursuits. These portrayals were almost always critical and satirical. Their purpose was to ridicule, condemn, and ultimately police such deviations from traditional norms. It was a clear cultural commentary on what they perceived as a dangerous loosening of traditional gender roles and a kind of female defiance of expected passivity and domesticity. They saw it as societal decline.
Okay, then came a major turning point. A really dramatic, almost cataclysmic shift with the advent and eventual dominance of Christianity, particularly in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Suddenly, those varied Roman attitudes, which were often hostile, sure, but perhaps not always absolute or uniformly enforced, seemed to solidify into something far more rigid, an absolute moral and theological prohibition. Paul of Tarsus, in his epistle to the Romans, explicitly condemned female homoeroticism. He stated it quite clearly in Romans 1.2627. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and the men likewise gave up natural intercourse with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. This specific articulation became a dominant theological stance that would shape Western morality for centuries upon centuries. Later Byzantine texts then further denounced what they explicitly called the feminine sin of sex with a woman, often using graphic and condemnatory language. You even see these practical, almost absurd-sounding rules emerge later, like certain nunneries implementing strict regulations for bidding nuns from even looking at each other's faces or touching hands, specifically to prevent any possibility of sexual attraction or engagement. It truly marked a categorical, absolute prohibition, rooted now in concepts of sin and spiritual damnation.
That transition from the varied, though often hostile, Roman attitudes to this absolute, unyielding prohibition under Christian influence is truly fascinating and deeply instructive, I think, about how societies construct morality over time. It illustrates so clearly how sexual norms are profoundly interconnected with broader socio-political, economic, and religious transformations. They don't exist in a vacuum. The Roman emphasis on procreation and male dominance, when combined with the later Christian emphasis on asceticism, the condemnation of specifically unnatural acts, and a completely new moral code centered on sin, that directly shaped the visibility, acceptability, and eventually the legal status of female homoeroticism. This fluidity in societal views demonstrates how dominant power structures, whether imperial or religious, dictate not only what is recorded but what is remembered, and ultimately what is condemned, often with severe real-world consequences for people. The shift tells us arguably more about the changing values of the society itself and the rise of a new spiritual authority than it does about the actual existence of these relationships, which almost certainly continue, just driven even more deeply into the shadows, further out of the public eye and the historical record.
Right. So Roman literature, while definitely sparse on this particular topic, does offer some portrayals of female same-sex desire. But it's absolutely crucial to remember, as you said, that these depictions almost exclusively come from male perspectives. And they are overwhelmingly steeped in criticism, ridicule, or at best, a kind of voyeuristic curiosity. We just have to read them with a very critical eye, always asking, what was the author's agenda here? What were they trying to achieve with this portrayal? Let's start with Ovid again. He's a key figure. His works were widely read by the Roman elite. In his Metamorphoses, specifically in Book 9, he tells the story of Iphis and Neanthe. And at first glance, it seems like a surprisingly sympathetic narrative, doesn't it? It depicts mutual longing and equal beauty between two women, Iphis and Neanthe, a relationship born out of a mother's trickery to save her daughter from infanticide if she was born female. It reads almost like a classical romance, depicting genuine affection between them.
However, and there's always a however with Ovid, it seems, this seemingly sympathetic story ultimately resolves with Iphis being magically transformed into a man by the goddess Isis just before their wedding day. So while it acknowledges female same-sex love, it forcefully reinforces a heteronormative outcome as the ultimate proper resolution. It's as if Ovid is saying, okay, this love can exist, but only temporarily. It can only truly be legitimized and fulfilled if one partner becomes male. It suggests that even the most sympathetic narratives had to operate within that ultimate framework of Roman heteronormativity. Such a relationship could only exist in its full, socially acceptable form if one partner became male, thus neatly fitting back into the accepted active-passive paradigm. Ovid, for all his supposed openness about love, was still writing for an audience deeply steeped in these norms and maybe shared them himself.
And then, in stark contrast to that seemingly sympathetic, if ultimately conventional, story, Ovid also presents Sappho, the famous Greek poetess from Lesbos, as a mannish tribade in Heroides 15. In this particular poem, Sappho is depicted as being utterly consumed by infatuation for a young man, a ferryman named Theon, and completely abandoning her female lovers for him. This suggests a much more hostile or satirical interpretation, doesn't it? It's almost as if he's portraying her known desires for women as just a phase she would or should inevitably grow out of in favor of a proper heterosexual relationship. It feels like a deliberate reinterpretation that completely erases her known historical context and the focus of her actual poetry.
Indeed. It's a fascinating and frankly quite problematic example of Roman male authors rewriting or co-opting a powerful female figure like Sappho to fit their own narratives and biases. They couldn't just ignore her prominence as a poet, but they could reframe her life and desires in a way that reinforced their own sexual norms and maybe diminished her status. It really highlights the subjective nature of historical accounts and how even celebrated figures from the past can be distorted to serve a particular cultural agenda in a later period. It's a form of appropriation.
Okay, now let's turn to the really scathing satirists, whose intent was rarely subtle. Martial, in particular, was notoriously crude and vulgar in his attacks on social norms he disliked. He mocked figures like Philaenis, whom he explicitly called a masculine Greek woman, note the Greek, implying foreignness, who supposedly took the penetrative role with both women and boys. He constantly highlighted her un-Roman nature and her excessive sexual appetites as a primary source of ridicule and condemnation. Martial's epigrams were designed to be short, punchy, and often shocking. They entertained his audience partly by portraying deviations from social norms in the most grotesque and exaggerated terms possible.
Martial also expressed a kind of profound bewilderment, almost a feigned confusion, regarding a woman named Bassa who engaged in sex with other women. He labeled her actions a portent worthy of a Theban riddle. That specific phrase implies it was so perplexing and threatening to established norms that it was almost mythological in its abnormality, something fundamentally incomprehensible to a proper Roman man. These satirical attacks really reveal a deep societal discomfort, maybe even a fear, and certainly a clear desire to ridicule or condemn any non-normative behaviors that threaten the established patriarchal order. The humor, such as it was often derived from the discomfort of the audience being confronted with something they deemed deeply transgressive or unnatural.
And Juvenal, another major satirist writing slightly later than Martial, was equally scathing. He often linked female same-sex relations directly to broader cultural anxieties about the increasing independence of women and their deviation from traditional roles. For these men, female desire existing outside of male control or participation wasn't just about deviant sex, it was presented as a dangerous sign of a society in moral decline, a crumbling of traditional Roman virtues like pietas and modesty. His famous satires often lament what he saw as the widespread moral decay of Rome, and female masculinity, or perceived sexual agency, was a frequent and vicious target of his critique.
Then you have the medical and moralistic pathologizing, which adds yet another layer to the condemnation, framing it not just as immoral, but as unhealthy or unnatural. The Greek physician Soranus, writing in the 2nd century CE, in his text on Pathic men, which ironically is mostly about male effeminacy, described Tribas. He called them women who were more eager to lie with women than with men, pursuing other women with almost masculine jealousy, and engaging in what he termed a disgraceful mode of life, and an abuse of their sexual powers. Now, this isn't just a neutral description, it's a medical framing that turns female same-sex desire into a deviation, a pathology, something to be diagnosed and implicitly cured, or at least controlled. It frames it as a physical or psychological abnormality. Similarly, the philosopher Seneca the Younger, a prominent Stoic moralist, asserted that women who rejected their womanly nature, which for him meant their prescribed passivity in domestic roles, and who dared to play the part of men, were essentially condemned to suffer the diseases of men as a direct result of their vices. This illustrates a very clear moralistic condemnation, rooted deeply in the perceived transgression of traditional gender roles, where female desire operating outside the norm was directly tied to their physical health, their well-being, and potentially even their spiritual damnation.
And as we mentioned earlier, Paul of Tarsus cemented that theological stance that would become so dominant for centuries. He explicitly condemned female homoeroticism as unnatural in his epistle to the Romans. This wasn't just one philosopher's moral judgment anymore. It became framed as the divine prohibition with immense and lasting historical, legal, and social impact that echoed down through millennia in Western culture.
And just one more literary example, Lucianus of Samosata, a Roman-era Greek writer known for his satirical dialogues. He showed a peculiar, almost voyeuristic curiosity in his dialogues of the courtesans. He portrayed a female-bodied character who explicitly identified as male, named Megilla, seducing a female Kithara player named Demonassa. This depiction, while perhaps not overtly condemning in the same way as Martial, certainly highlights a fascination, maybe even titillation, with female-bodied individuals engaging in same-sex acts and challenging gender norms. Yet, in another of his works, Erotes, or Affairs of the Heart, Lucianus described women having sex with women as monstrous toys of sterility and filthy lesbians, demonstrating a much more overtly derogatory viewpoint. This reflects the prevailing male disgust and condemnation of non-procreative female sexuality. It also shows the often contradictory nature of even a single author's views, perhaps reflecting broader societal tensions and ambivalence.
Right. But despite this overwhelming literary silence or outright hostility, some non-literary sources from the imperial era do offer that vital counter-narrative, like those magical spells we talked about. These are absolutely crucial, I think, because they come from completely different spheres of life than the elite male literary world. They offer these fleeting glimpses into the everyday lived experiences of ordinary Romans, perhaps. I'm talking about things like those Greek language women's homoerotic binding spells from Roman Egypt, dating from the 2nd to 4th century CE, but also other forms like medical writing that, well, while often pathologizing, as you said, still implicitly acknowledge the existence of these women. Texts on astrology that might comment on planetary influences leading to masculine women, and even dream interpretation manuals that sometimes mention same-sex erotic dreams and try to decipher their meaning. These are the fragments, the scattered pieces we have to work with.
These sources are absolutely crucial precisely because they are often private and practical documents. They're unlike the frequently public, rhetorical, and ideologically charged literary discourse produced by the elite. They strongly suggest that female same-sex desire was a lived reality for some women, even if it wasn't openly acknowledged or celebrated in mainstream texts. They offer a fragmented, but arguably a more authentic glimpse into private lives, beliefs, and anxieties. The dichotomy here is profound, isn't it? The literary works often create this hostile, mocking, or pathologizing narrative, while these private documents show that for some individuals it was simply a part of their emotional and sexual reality, something for which they sought tangible, if magical, solutions or understanding. It forces us to acknowledge that the unheard of narrative was very likely a constructed one, perhaps a deliberate act of historical erasure or simply profound ignorance, not a reflection of universal truth across the diverse Roman world.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, archaeological findings offer equally unique, though sometimes just as ambiguous, glimpses into this hidden aspect of Roman life. They provide physical evidence where texts often fail us or remain silent. One really notable piece is a graffito found on a wall in Pompeii, in a house known rather charmingly as the House of the Moralist, located near the entrance. It's written in Latin, and importantly, it uses feminine grammatical endings for both the speaker and the person being addressed. It reads something like, "I wish I could hold to my neck and embrace the little arms and bear kisses on the tender lips. Go on, doll, and trust your joys to the winds. Believe me, light is the nature of men."
Ah, yes, that inscription. It's incredibly compelling precisely because it's such a rare potential instance of a woman's own voice expressing what could be interpreted as a same-sex sentiment. However, it's also wonderfully and frustratingly ambiguous, which, as we know, is so often the case with ancient sources like graffiti. Scholars debate its meaning quite intensely. It could be a woman addressing another woman, expressing affection or longing. perhaps after experiencing a betrayal by a man, hence the final cynical line. That final line, "Believe me, light is the nature of man," certainly suggests a disillusionment with male partners, which could lead to a turn towards female companionship or solace. But it could also be interpreted as a woman addressing herself, a kind of poetic soliloquy reflecting on painful past experiences with men. Or maybe even just a lament expressing general cynicism about men addressed to a generic female doll. This ambiguity really underscores the challenges of interpreting ancient inscriptions without more direct context. But it certainly points to the possibility of female same-sex desire being articulated in a woman's own voice written on a wall for others to see, which is almost unheard of in other sources. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who wrote it and what their life was really like behind those Pompeian walls just before the eruption.
Perhaps even more striking, visually at least, are the frescoes from the suburban baths in Pompeii. These are, as far as we know, the only known examples of Roman art that explicitly depict sexual congress between women. They are truly unique in their explicitness, and their very existence challenges that unheard-of narrative. These frescoes were found in a private room, likely an apoditarium or changing room, within the suburban baths complex, which was a popular public bathing spot located just outside the city walls of Pompeii. One scene, labeled Scene V by archaeologists, explicitly illustrates two women apparently using a dildo, with one woman seeming to penetrate the other. Another scene, Scene the Seventh, portrays a larger orgy scene where one woman is shown performing cunnilingus on another woman, alongside other heterosexual acts happening in the same image. These are not subtle or implied depictions. They are clear, graphic, visual representations of female sexual acts.
Yes, these murals depict acts that were likely considered unusual or even transgressive by conventional Roman customs of the time. This context suggests they might have been intended for ribald humor, perhaps, or a specific, maybe daring form of titillation for the bath's clientele, rather than being presented as a normative representation of Roman sexuality. The setting of a bathhouse, which was often a place of diverse social mixing and sometimes associated with sexual activity, makes this interpretation quite plausible. But regardless of their precise intent, whether for humor, titillation, or something else, their very existence confirms the visual representation and thus the conceptualization of female sexual acts within Roman society. It undeniably challenges the unheard-of narrative that many Roman authors propagated. It shows that these acts were not only known, but were depicted visually, even if perhaps within specific, potentially transgressive contexts. This archaeological evidence, despite its interpretive limitations, offers direct, concrete data. It gives us glimpses into interactions happening outside the pervasive male-authored literary condemnation, forcing us to acknowledge a more complex, possibly messier, reality of Roman life and imagination. It's a powerful counterpoint to the literary silence, showing these things were seen, even if not approved of.
Okay, let's talk about labels. The ancient world did have specific terms for women who engaged in same-sex relations, even if they were often negative. But it's important, isn't it, to understand these terms are very different from how we define sexual identity today. Take Tribas or frictrix. What do these terms immediately tell us about how Romans viewed these acts?
Well, as we touched on earlier, the very etymology of Tribas and frictrix, both essentially meaning to rub, reveals that very male-centric attempt to define female acts purely in physical terms of friction. It's almost as if they were trying to grasp what could possibly be happening sexually when a penis wasn't involved in the way they understood sex. It's a very reductionist and, yes, often derogatory lens. They also had terms like heteristria in Greek, which referred more broadly to a woman who associated closely with other women, though often implying a sexual or even a professional relationship like courtesans associating. The term sapphist obviously referenced the Greek poet Sappho, and was sometimes used as the female equivalent of sodomite, again attaching a clear moral judgment and often implying active penetration. In Latin, they also used virago, which specifically implied a masculine woman, thereby linking female same-sex desire directly to a transgression of expected gender roles, a woman acting like a man. Then there were adjectives derived from Sappho's island, Lesbos, like lesbius, lesbia, lesbium, to refer to things related to female same-sex activity, and nouns like lesbius or lesbiadosis for a lesbian woman. Interestingly, the abstract noun lesbianismus was also apparently used occasionally for lesbianism or tribadism, indicating a formal, though probably still pejorative, recognition of the concept itself, even if condemned.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is that ancient Greek and Latin didn't really have direct equivalents for our modern terms, like gay, lesbian, or straight. They generally did not conceive of sexual preference as a fixed, innate aspect of a person's core identity, which is so foundational to our modern understanding of sexuality, isn't it?
Exactly. Instead, as we've discussed, they conceived of sexuality primarily in terms of sexual roles, active versus passive, and the social status of the partners involved. That was the primary grid they used. This conceptual difference is paramount. It highlights the challenge, and indeed the potential danger, of anachronistically applying our modern identity categories onto these ancient contexts. We risk misinterpreting their world through our lens. The existence of specific terminology, even if it was often derogatory, shows that these behaviors were recognized and categorized. But crucially, always through a male-centric lens and often with clear moral condemnation attached. The recurring focus on rubbing or masculinity for one woman reveals the Roman attempt to somehow force female-female sex into their existing active-passive penetrative framework. Since the natural male penetrative role was absent, they either had to imagine a masculine penetrative role for one woman, hence the Tribas, or they reduced the act to non-penetrative rubbing, which might have been perceived as less real sex and thus perhaps less threatening to male sexual dominance. This really demonstrates how language isn't merely descriptive. It's also a powerful carrier of cultural values, prejudices, and a tool for social control, actively shaping how non-normative behaviors are understood and stigmatized. These words weren't neutral labels, they were judgments designed to reinforce social boundaries and hierarchies.
Okay, we've touched on this throughout our discussion, but it really bears repeating and synthesizing clearly. The difference in documentation and social perception between male and female same-sex relations in ancient Rome is just absolutely striking. It's almost like we're talking about two completely different historical realities playing out side by side. It's a fundamental asymmetry.
Indeed, it truly is. Love or desire between males is a very frequent, almost commonplace theme in Roman literature and art. It appears across various literary genres, poetry, farces, satires from early Republican works like Plautus, right through to the high poetry of the Augustan age and later. It's pervasive and often openly discussed. In stark contrast, same-sex relations among women are far, far less documented. References are infrequent in the Republic and early Principate, and they remain scattered, often hidden or ambiguous, even in the imperial era when sources become more plentiful overall. Visual art also strongly reflects this disparity. We have numerous depictions showing sexual contact between males, but only that tiny handful for females, like those frescoes from Pompeii, and even those are arguably ambiguous in intent or presented as transgressive.
And when it comes to social acceptance and stigma, the contrast is equally stark, maybe even starker. For male-male sex, as we noted, freeborn Roman men could engage in sexual relations with other males without necessarily suffering a perceived loss of masculinity or social status, provided they consistently remained dominant and penetrative. Acceptable partners were typically those of lower social standing slaves, prostitutes, actors, individuals whose social status placed them outside the realm where infamia, legal dishonor, might apply to the passive partner. Sexual relations where a freeborn man took the passive role, especially with another man of equal or lower status, or with freeborn minors, however, were generally considered taboo or scandalous. But the crucial point is that male homoeroticism, when deemed acceptable within these strict parameters, was often explicitly linked to communications of power and authority. It reinforced the active man's dominance and social privilege. It was almost an expression of their established place in the hierarchy.
Conversely, Roman men, as represented in our sources, viewed female same-sex relations with significant, often profound, hostility. It was perceived as a fundamental challenge, not only to their presumed role as the exclusive givers of sexual pleasure, but also to the most basic foundations of Rome's profoundly male-dominated culture. While no explicit, definitive legal prohibition against female same-sex relationships is known from the core Roman period, strong societal stigma was clearly attached. This was particularly potent due to the absolute expectation for women of the elite classes to marry Roman men and produce legitimate offspring to continue the family line and the state. Given the state's high valuation of procreation, especially under emperors like Augustus, exclusive same-sex relationships were seen as a direct hindrance to this crucial contribution to the population. And that Tribas figure we discussed was specifically regarded as an offense precisely for adopting a male-dominant role, thus disrupting the established sexual hierarchy and presenting a terrifying vision of female agency operating entirely outside male control or definition. The social penalties, though perhaps not codified legally in the same way as for men, would undoubtedly have been immense, ranging from public ridicule and satire to potentially severe social ostracization.
The application of that core active-passive dichotomy further highlights this fundamental difference in how the two were viewed. Roman ideals of masculinity, virtus, were predicated on taking an active, penetrative role in all spheres, including sex. To be a passive male was seen as a profound threat to a free citizen's liberty, autonomy, and sexual integrity, leading to the use of those highly derogatory terms for passive males like senatus or pathicus, marking them as effeminate, dishonorable, and unfit for public life.
And for female sex, male writers, in their often crude and bewildered attempts to comprehend it, frequently imagine that one woman must be taking the active role. They imagine she would either use a dildo, an alisbos, or perhaps possess an exceptionally large clitoris allowing for penetration, and that she would be the one experiencing pleasure from this active role, mimicking the male experience. This reflects that persistent male-centric need to somehow force female sex into their existing active phallic framework. Even though, interestingly, dildos are surprisingly rarely mentioned in Roman sources, specifically in the context of female sex, suggesting this might have been more of a conceptual workaround in the male imagination than a widespread documented reality. It really reveals a deep conceptual struggle, a fundamental difficulty for them to understand or even describe what they viewed as a fundamentally alien act that defied their established sexual logic and hierarchies. So this stark contrast between the extensive documentation and conditional acceptance of male homoeroticism, which was rooted in power dynamics and the reinforcement of male dominance, and the scarcity of evidence and outright hostility towards female homoeroticism, which was rooted in anxieties about gender roles, female agency, and procreation, reveals a fundamental asymmetry in Roman sexual discourse. Male same-sex relations, when adhering to the active-passive paradigm and reinforcing social hierarchy, could actually be integrated into the patriarchal system. It was often about exercising privilege and dominance. In contrast, female same-sex relations, by their very nature, lacked the required male penetrative partner and often inherently challenged the prescribed passive female role. This inevitably led to their marginalization, condemnation, and relative invisibility in the historical record produced by that system. This highlights how Roman sexual norms were not simply about the gender of attraction. They were deeply embedded in social hierarchy, power structures, and the state's overriding interest in population growth and social order. What was acceptable or condemned was largely determined by whether it reinforced or challenged the existing social order. This explains why male same-sex relations could be integrated under specific conditions, while female ones were largely marginalized and condemned. It really reveals the highly politicized nature of sexuality in ancient Rome, where sexual acts and norms were often proxies for broader issues of social control, status, and power.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, it's incredibly clear that reconstructing a nuanced understanding of female same-sex relationships in ancient Rome is a really challenging, but I think absolutely essential task. Primarily because of those overwhelming male-centric biases embedded in almost all of our historical sources. We are constantly looking through a lens that was often dismissive, mocking, or simply uninterested in women's lives outside of their relation to men. It forces us to read between the lines and often really read against the grain of the texts themselves.
Exactly. That unheard of narrative pushed by some Roman authors like Ovid is undeniably incomplete. It's a projection, not a full reality. The scattered evidence we find in less conventional sources, those magical papyri from Egypt, those ambiguous Pompeian graffiti, those explicit bathhouse frescoes, strongly suggests a far more complex reality, a reality of lived experiences that existed outside or maybe beneath the dominant public discourse, often hidden away in private spheres or only surfacing through the distorting lens of satire and condemnation. These are just glimpses, fragments, yes, but they are vital ones that chip away at that imposing wall of silence.
This deep dive truly shows us, I think, how historical narratives are profoundly shaped by power and perspective. Who gets to tell the story matters enormously. The subjective experiences, the emotions, the identities of the women involved are largely absent or heavily mediated through male eyes and male concerns. This requires us, as people interested in the past, to look beyond the obvious silences and even beyond the explicit condemnations to try and recover something of their reality. It's a powerful reminder that history is never a complete picture, and we have to constantly question the narratives we inherit and re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes.
And modern scholarship continues to challenge these traditional interpretations, thankfully. Researchers are seeking new methodologies, looking at different kinds of sources like material culture or those non-literary texts to try and uncover these hidden histories. Moving beyond simplistic narratives of just condemnation or non-existence to build a more comprehensive and maybe more empathetic understanding, it's really about piecing together fragments, however small or ambiguous they might be, to try and paint a richer, more accurate picture of a past that was undoubtedly far more diverse and complex than the dominant records often suggest.
So, considering how much was overlooked or perhaps deliberately marginalized in the Roman records regarding women's lives and relationships, what other unheard of histories might still be hidden beneath the surface of official records? not just from Rome, but from other times and places too. History is waiting for a critical and interdisciplinary lens to finally uncover them. Think about that as you go about your day. The stories we tell, and crucially the stories we don't tell, or choose to ignore, shape our understanding of the past in such profound ways. And that in turn impacts our present and how we imagine our future.